And it's been a tough week for South African consumers. The poor and middle class have been bearing the brunt of the high cost of living. As tax season kicked off, consumers were hit with new tariffs on electricity, water and municipal rates. The burden on the middle class and tax-paying base is slowly increasing. We take a look at that this afternoon with my two guests. Linda Meyer is an educational specialist and an academic at Boston City Campus and Business College. And Peter Faber is a senior tax executive at the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants. Welcome to you both. Thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Right, Peter, I'm going to start with you. Historically, the middle class has been buffered by privilege, but more and more we're seeing their position weakening in the face of ever-increasing tax and rate increases, as we've just been mentioning there. How's this turnaround come about? What's brought it about?
Well, I think to a large extent, Anli, it's about disposable income. So how much do I actually have to play around with? And that is determined by various factors, and I don't think it's just tax. I think that's the problem, is that if we look at medical expenses, we look at schooling, etc., there's a lot of other expenses that the middle class in the last 20 years have not necessarily had to incur at the levels they are now. And all of that squeezed together with a lot of things like taxes at both national and local government level have affected disposable income. And I think that's probably the bigger question, because tax can be neither here nor there. I mean, you can have high taxes and still have great value and not a squeezed middle class.
Yeah, I think that this is what I'm trying to get to here is that they're paying higher tax and they're paying all these additional costs and not necessarily seeing the kinds of rewards from tax incentives that other countries might offer, such as free education.
Correct. So your disposable income is being taken up by things that you would have expected, things like tax to cover. Okay. And I think that to a large extent is where we're starting to see the squeeze, is call it value for money from both the taxes you pay and other things you pay.
Yeah. Linda, to come to you, what kind of broader changes is this squeeze creating? How do we see the middle class changing?
The middle class are spending their disposable income on different things. So we'll see that people now, for example, are using their credit cards for basic things like food services and not for luxury goods anymore. And we'll see that the middle class are also taking their children out of private schooling, moving them to Model C schools. We see from the medical aid industry that people are moving from full medical aid to hospital plans. So there's a residual knock-on effect across the board. But we also see, as the economy obviously becomes constrained, that there's poor fiscal growth and that people start prioritizing about what is important to them to just live. We see now, this week it was announced that people are selling their homes and renting homes, for example, because to get the basics, to put petrol in their cars, to get to their places of employment is becoming a necessity. It's not a luxury anymore to be able to weigh these things and to make sure that the priorities are about feeding your family and having a house, you know, that has a roof over your head for your family. So people are becoming increasingly more despondent, and their spending patterns are changing significantly.
Peter, why do you think the Revenue Service has diverted their attention from large corporates to the middle class and targeting them specifically? They've come out saying no holds barred, they're going in guns blazing, and they're going to ensure that the middle class pays their taxes on time, and that there will be no more dodging or no more leniency for the middle class.
I doubt that they've diverted, really, but I do think it becomes about broadening the base properly. If you just look at the analysis of some of this, we talk about the middle class. If you look at the people who are actually paying pay-as-you-earn, that's about 5 million people out of the 20 million people on register. The middle class, if you can define it from a tax perspective or from a pay-as-you-earn perspective, probably sit in the 70 to 350,000 rand a year band, because that's about where 60% of your taxpayers are sitting. And if you look at their contribution to the national take, that's gone down in the last 5 years from about 27% to 19%. Notwithstanding that the people in the 500,000 plus band have gone from just about 55 to nearly 66% of the total tax contribution. So it is clear that at least on a pay-as-you-earn scale, it is very progressive, and that the contribution from that part of the middle class, and I think a lot of people would have actually expected a lot more people in the 0 to 70,000 rand band, given where unemployment is in South Africa. But it's clearly that's not where the majority of people who are actually in. They're actually in a much higher band than that. So I don't think there's a specific to squeeze, but I do think there is a lot of avoidance. And it might be people with secondary trades, it might be smaller business, it might be the informal sector all falling within that. But I do think the focus on things like, government's made it clear, on big business, transfer pricing, etc., that remains.
Okay. So it's not a shift of focus, it's an additional focus.
It's an additional focus.
Everyone.
Correct.
Right. The squeeze does mean that the middle class are finding themselves downwardly mobile. What long-term implications does that have, Linda? I'm going to go to you here. For the broader economy, if there are fewer people in the middle class to squeeze and less coming out of that squeezed tap, what happens?
So we see that our individual tax base is very high, so of the highest in the world. And we see that our corporate tax is quite moderate, because government's fiscal policy has been around ensuring that the economy can grow and businesses are left with leniency so that they can create jobs. But we haven't seen that happen. We can see that the reverse, in fact, is happening. So the tax base is basically being taxed to death. And unless there are new jobs entering the economy, unless we have a economic growth of at least 6%, where we can absorb these new taxpayers and where the economy is stimulated to create new jobs, we're going to see that government has to get the money from somewhere. So we see, for example, from a report from F&B, that the middle class spend their entire salaries within 5 days of getting it. And that is very difficult, because you know that people then start living on credit and they start living above their means, because that's the effect. So what will happen is that economic pressures where people will stop investing and buying, and that obviously will have a knock-on effect into the economic growth of businesses within the sector and within the industry. And people's lives are going to become more difficult.
Why is the leniency tax related on corporates not having the desired effect? Why is it not stimulating and increasing growth?
Well, the tax mix, we have to understand that, once again, companies are just flow-through entities to a large extent. Their revenues are very unstable. And if you look at the revenue contribution since 2008 up till now, it's been fluctuating. So your standard consumption taxes and your payroll taxes are the most stable. So from a fiscal policy point of view, like anybody else, government needs to make sure that it can rely the most on the numbers it projects. And that's why you have a more skewed. Before 2008, there was more of a 50-50 partiality. It also talks to the economy. People aren't making profits. Once again, tax statistics released end of last year, even though you had the number of tax payers increasing about 4.9%, you had the number of tax-paying companies decreasing by 16%. So it's not that they aren't making profits. In fact, a lot of them are closing down. So in a down-pressed economy, you aren't going to be able to squeeze a corporate anymore, because a corporate, once again, is just a flow-through in principle. The more it has economic growth to turn into profits, the more you are going to be able to get out of them, and the less there is. And that what they produce also goes back into things like consumption, salaries, etc. So the taxes that the corporate represent flow through the entity as well. So I think it's a bit of a misnomer to compare corporates directly with people, so to speak, from a tax mix policy point of view.
Okay. Linda, a lot of the people who have managed to work themselves up from lower income brackets into the middle class, and we're speaking specifically here about the black middle class, are also finding themselves downwardly mobile because they are also under additional pressures of black tax, trying to redistribute wealth to those left in the poverty lines who are not in the middle class yet. What kind of impact does this middle class financial squeeze have on them specifically?
So we know from economic data that we need to grow our middle class by at least 50% for us to have a broader tax base, for a number of reasons, and a number of things to happen. But I think these are all systemic issues, and we need to look at what is really causing this. So we need positive economic growth, we need the stimulus to come in, we need foreign direct investment, all of these narratives that we've been speaking about for a very long time. We need government to have, for business, a more relaxed labour environment. So, it's for people that are in the middle class, and we speak about the middle class as people that really know where their next meal comes from. We're not speaking about the different categories of people that are impoverished or underemployed. So the middle class is carrying the tax base, and that's why there is a particular focus on them. But we have millions of people. We have 10 million people in our country who do not know where their next meal comes from. So it's a broader issue, and that we keep on squeezing. So unless things are going to change systemically, we're just going to see people becoming more impoverished and more despondent, and the economy will not be able to shoulder this in the long term.
So we have a tendency in South Africa to talk about the vast divide, especially when you highlight areas like Houghton being next to informal settlements. That divide is often in the spotlight, and the middle class sort of gets lost in between in discussion. How important is it to not only address issues of poverty? I know the government is under incredible pressure on all fronts to do a range of things. But there isn't pressure from the middle class on the government. It's very much the other way. Why is the middle class often forgotten?
So the issue around the middle class is they do have a voice, and obviously they voice that through their votes that they have in the government that they elect. And we know that, largely people vote that are on the social grant system. So, yes, they are often lost as the tax base. And how is it that they have their voice made clear, and loud, is by the choices that they make. I suppose that is why we're seeing, for example, a brain drain, people leaving the country with the skill sets that they have to go and make a better life elsewhere. It's not necessarily true in fact, but this is the perception that people have, and that's why we have the data of people leaving the country. So how do they make those choices about what is important to them? Where do they live? And so we know, for example, Gauteng. I mean, if we look at the tax base, my esteemed colleague here next to me might be in a better position, but Gauteng carries in the individual taxpayer 40% of the tax base. So, it's also a national issue around where people are located, the impoverished situation in specific provinces, and how we deal with those issues.
Peter, is someone squeezing, or is the squeeze a natural product of momentum, economic momentum?
Well, yeah, I think it's once again a conflation of a very lot of factors that all started to happen at the same time. From the fact that South Africa, both in private and the public sector, we live above our means. We probably in both our private and public sector, some of the most indebted and growing as well. The income growth, obviously, in a depressed economy hasn't been that great. So if your expenses are growing at a lot faster rate than your income, it's going to add a squeeze. And once again, if your disposable income is dropping because of all the other expenses increasing, and the value that you're getting is decreasing as a result. So whether it is the fact that you're going to pay higher premiums for something because there are potholes, or that your electricity is down and you have to buy these things all contribute to the additional money you have to spend that you would not have spent. So once again, getting value for money for these various things. So I don't think it's necessarily a dedicated squeeze. I do think it's a conflation of facts, all happening at the same time. And the middle class, I think, becomes a squeeze, so to say, because you have less of an impact. So we've already spoken to the poor, you usually have by number, and obviously the rich you have by influence. And in the middle, you got somebody who is not enough in number, or has enough influence to actually exert something that is specifically targeted to their needs. But I think to a large extent, that's then where they find themselves both here. And the number is progressively quite small. Once again, as I noted, about just over 2.9 million people in that tax bracket in a country of 60 million people. So that's a very small number comparatively. I had a similar statistic if you look at something like Australia, 25 million people with about 17 million actually assessed taxpayers. Here you have 60 million people with only 5 million people as assessed taxpayers. So there's a lot of a disparity between that. So you need to grow that number for one, so that that number actually starts representing the people by number with a voice. And therefore you can start driving change, whether it's economic change, increases within municipal rates, etc., value for money. That's to a large extent.
Linda, last question for you. We're seeing a pushback against e-tolls, specifically from the middle class, and that's been in the spotlight again this week. Do you think that is correct, a pushback from the middle class against e-tolls, or is that a broader pushback, and how does that play into the squeeze?
So I think we must remember that the middle class are largely educated people, and the pushback around e-tolls is not necessarily that people don't want to pay for the services that are being provided, but for all the, for lack of a better word, fraudulent residual elements that have been attached to it. So they don't want to pay for a foreign company that is making them pay 3 times more than they should for a value exchange in that service. And I think it goes largely to what we said earlier. What is the value exchange in everything that we get? Whether it is in e-tolls, whether it is in schools, whether it is in hospitals. As a taxpayer, if half my salary just about is going towards taxes, I want to make use of public hospitals. I want my children to go to a Model C school and not have to send them to a private school. I don't want to pay e-tolls, and I certainly don't want to pay e-tolls 3 times the amount that I should be paying. But if it's a value exchange where I'm getting a tarred road that is safe, where I'm not being hijacked on the road, where I know there's not potholes on the road, there's a value exchange for me, and I'm willing to pay that. But people are really, as we've seen, people are really frustrated. They're at the end of their tether, and they're having to balance their priorities. So our debt-to-income ratio is very high in South Africa, but not only for the individuals, but also for government. Everybody needs to curb spending. Everybody needs to make wiser decisions until we get out of this, this looming inflationary reality that that is looming for us. So what is the middle class really about? It's about the people that pay the taxes and make our life possible. And there must be a level of respect for what it is that they contribute to the economy.
All right, so very much the sentiment coming out of that the squeeze on the middle class is not as much financial as it is in terms of lifestyle and, like you've said, a value exchange. Value for the kind of input that you get, and a very much of a frustration and a lack of enjoyment from life.
Indeed. We must also know that people want a better life for their children, a better life that they had, a better life than their parents had. So when they see that those realities are not being balanced and really is not something that they can look towards in the future, they become despondent and distressed.
Right, thank you very much both for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for watching. This has been Story of the Week, and I've been chatting to Peter Faber from the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants and academic from Boston City Campus and Business College, Linda Meyer. Up soon here on ENCA, our reporter Dazen Tatia spent your weekend spent time. Apologies for that. We'll come back shortly after the break. We'll chat about the homeless.